Hosea isn't a biblical book that we hear from very often. Across the 3-year lectionary cycle, it only appears 7 times. Even then, there's no guarantee that that'll be selected as one of the preaching texts. Nevertheless, Hosea is actually one of my favorite of the biblical books, and one that presents us with a powerful metaphor for God's unfailing and steadfast love. It's also a tough book. In it, God commands Hosea to marry a woman who simply cannot remain faithful to the relationship. Her choices wound Hosea time and time again, cutting him to the heart, and yet he loves his wife and chooses to stay with her and remain faithful himself, despite what she is doing to him. While Hosea is gendered in this way, the book is gendered in this way, the story will be equally true of a licentious husband who repeatedly cheats on his wife. Either way, this scenario becomes an allegory for God's relationship with humanity. Whether it was worshiping the golden calf in the Exodus story, or in Hosea's own time, the people turning to the worship of the false god Baal, we are the unfaithful spouse who repeatedly spurns God's love. That has been the cycle of broken covenants in which we betray our marital vows, even as God remains faithful to us, despite what we are doing. Now, God's faithfulness here doesn't necessarily prevent us from suffering the natural consequences of what amounts to self-harming behavior. And so it is that we hear Hosea share God's words this morning, that God will step back, return home, grieved, but waiting, until we realize the mistakes that we have made. That's how Hosea presents God in grief, stepping away. In the story, the unfaithful spouse chases after past lovers because they have given gifts of bread and water and wool and flax and oil and wine, all fine things 3,000 years ago. You can supplement that with what we might think of today: money, luxuries, jewelry. Goes on. But in seeking these gifts alone, they are led astray. This unfaithful spouse is led astray into the wilderness. Then and only then, alone, out in the cold, will humanity seek God's face once more. I will go and return to my first husband, Hosea has the spouse say, for it was better with me then than now. But can you hear that remaining degree of insincerity that's within all of us? We return, Hosea tells us, primarily for the blessings, for the gifts. We return for healing. We return for security. We return for prosperity, which is not the same thing as returning for love. Come, let us return to the Lord, for it is He who has torn, and He will heal us. He has struck down, and He will bind us up. Let us press on to know the Lord. His appearing is as sure as the dawn. He will come to us like the showers, like the spring rains that water the earth. Hosea tells us all this in almost a sarcastic voice. We humans accurately recognize the absolute fidelity of God. He will appear as sure as the dawn. And yet the divine critique immediately pours forth. Our own faithfulness is like a morning cloud, like a dew that goes away early, those first misty dawnings that that as the sun appears, flees away. That's the image of giving. That even as we cry out for God, as soon as God appears, we're off again. Our faithfulness vanishes quickly, and as soon as we receive our blessing, humankind is off again, like the unfaithful partner that we are. In short, we have a tendency to be transactional where God is relational. We want the marriage to the extent that we're able to benefit from it, to advance our personal goals and interests, to have that metaphorical house with the white picket fence, everything that we dreamed of. That's what we want out of the marriage. Whereas God cares far more about the quality of the bond, the depth of intimacy, vulnerability, and unconditional love. We are transactional, where God is relational. This is the context for our gospel passage this morning, in which Jesus directly references this Hosea passage in his rebuke of the Pharisees. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He is, in effect, accusing the Pharisees of being like that unfaithful spouse. They're doing everything right. They're making all the right sacrifices. They're following all the laws, following all the rules in the hope that God will bless them. And in fact, God just wants to be in relationship with them. We're always tempted, I think, when we hear this particular gospel story, to focus on the healing of the woman. That's the moment that gets captured in religious artwork, that lives on in our cultural imagination. And I'm not trying to say that's wrong, but let's set that aside this morning. Because I want to suggest to you that the reference to Hosea might just shift the whole narrative framework somewhat. Because stepping back, as we've heard, the healing of the woman and the raising of the dead girl are both vignettes that take place within a larger story about Jesus' willingness to share the table with culturally distasteful and religiously unfaithful people. And this juxtaposition between Hosea and Matthew, this represents, in fact, one of our core claims about Jesus of Nazareth, who we proclaim to be the Son of the living God. No longer, when we are unfaithful, does God remove himself, step away, as he did in Hosea, departing from us and returning to his place, you can imagine, in the temple, right? Rather, in Jesus, God has left the temple and is now openly, passionately pursuing us. He follows us out into that wilderness of our unfaithfulness. And that is why Jesus does not just reside in the temple all day. He doesn't just hang out debating with the scholars. He's not waiting for people to come to him, but instead, he goes out into the marketplace. He finds Matthew and calls him. And then he goes home, and he dines with tax collectors and sinners. He gathers them round the dinner table. This is the very image of the God whose passionate desire chases us into the darkness of our own failures. To some extent, in fact, the miracles in the story emerge as something of a distraction from Jesus' primary goal. He's there eating with the tax collectors when there's an emergency. A young girl has died, and he leaps from the table and goes out. And then before he can even get to that event, there's another emergency and distraction in a woman who touches his cloak. And he moves through them. He responds to them, of course. But the story began with this intimate, vulnerable dwelling with the unfaithful. Those miracles, they serve as examples of God's unconditional love, freely dispensed without cost, without sacrifice. Mercy is simply given out of love. But the perennial risk is that while those gifts might be received joyfully in the moment, the recipient may be more interested in the gift than the gift giver. That's my whole point to you this morning. That when we receive God's blessing, we might be more interested in the gift than the gift giver. That we might be just like those insincere people in Hosea's story, who come back to God just for the blessing, who seek healing and restoration, but whose faith vanishes as quickly as that morning dew. Now, don't hear me wrong. If you are seeking a miracle this morning, that is entirely appropriate. I'm praying for one myself, have been, for quite some time. But if that is the only reason we are here, then we might be risking Hosea's rebuke. So instead, as we gather this morning to receive the gift of communion, we should also do so out of a desire to truly receive and reciprocate God's love for us as well. Perhaps, too, we might learn to share that love with one another. That is the great commandment, after all. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Not transactionally, because we're seeking a gift or we're seeking some benefit or personal gain. The love itself is the point. Just like those tax collectors and sinners, we gather around this table with God for the sake of the restored relationship, coming in out of the wilderness, returning to our first and primary spouse, the one who loves us in a way that no earthly mind can comprehend. And certainly, just like in our gospel passages, emergencies arise that interrupt our meal, that cause Jesus to rise and go out and perform miracles. But the ultimate goal seems to be that he wants to return to that intimacy of our shared meal together, God and humanity, reunited once again. For I desire steadfast love. For I desire steadfast love. That is what God says to us through Hosea. So this morning, may our table be one of steadfast love and divine knowledge. May we be transformed by grace, such that we might be restored to fidelity of faith, seeking not only the gift, but the gift giver. Relational, not transactional. May it be so.